right. I love the intro. Super good. Makes me dance every morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Hello. How's everyone doing?
Happy Tuesday, gentlemen.
Whoa. That's you're right there? Hanging in there?
Yeah, hanging in there.
Long week, I guess. I presume
so
far.
Feeling under the weather.
Uh-oh.
Starting yesterday.
Yeah.
But you have much more exciting things than me talking about being under the weather.
I have been the world traveler. I take the opportunity to go out to conferences and just to enjoy people and hanging out with other like-minded nerds like us, and it is super fun. I just got back from going to the Power BI Next Step conference out in Denmark area, which is absolutely incredible. Love Denmark. We were at Billund, which is the home of Lego. And as you can see from my video, those of you who are watching live, I have a handful of Lego creations that are part of my collection, and it was super fun to be actually in the Lego facility. And we as being part of having the conference on. So let me phrase some things out here. There's in Billund, there's like two main attractions. There's the Lego house, and then there's Lego Land, which is like their theme park inside Billund. There's a very similar one. I went to the Lego Land, surprise, shocker, in Orlando, near Orlando area. So I've already been to the one in the US there. And then now I was able to compare, and they're very similar. There's a lot of similar attractions. So if you've been to the one in Orlando, it feels very much like the one that's in Billund, minus the palm trees. But it was super fun. And we had an opportunity to go see, they call it the Lego Ideas House, which is not the Lego house, and it's not the theme park. It's like an employee-only tour of their history. Just kind of walking through, like, so originally Lego made wooden toys, loved making the toys, had a couple factory fires, things kept burning down. Why they kept building factories out of wood, I don't know, but they kept doing it. You know, maybe we should just stop smoking in factories. That would probably be a good idea. Whatever.
Sawdust.
So, exactly.
Cutting little blocks.
Exactly. Cutting little boxes and smoking cigars throughout the factory probably is not a good recipe for not having massive fires throughout the factory. Anyways, eventually they get around to buying these plastic injection molds and start building Legos, and it's very near and dear to my heart because I remember spending a lot of years as a kid. In the 80s, the Legos really kind of started taking off. They started building Technics and these, more mechanical things, and I really enjoyed it. So super amazing. The sad part of the whole thing was we get through the Lego tour, we go through the little and there's this. Have you guys ever heard of the thing called the Lego Vault? Have you heard of this?
Kind of like the Disney Vault.
It's the place where they keep every single created box of Legos ever made.
Oh,
so they have it's like every box they've created, every set, they have one copy of every single set, and it's in this massive vault, and they just keep filling it up with sets every time they make a new set. So I'm leaving the tour. I asked this lady at the front, and I was like, do you by chance know where the Lego vault is? She goes, oh, it's right beneath us. I was like, oh, can I see it? She goes, had you asked me 30 minutes earlier, I would have let you down and go see it. I was like, are you kidding me? She's like, I got to run. Maybe next time. I was like, no. I bet
that's on the employee card. If anyone asked you to go, say, had you asked me 30 minutes ago?
Yes. Yeah, right. I was like, oh man. I was like, I love the history, but I've heard the history before. I've seen burn me through the history. Let me see the Lego vault, man. Let me see all the Lego sets and just kind of take a look at all the different sets that were. It's shelves and shelves and right from the very beginning, and they just keep newer and newer and newer. They just keep stacking up the boxes for the newer stuff. I didn't even think you could even go see it, but if they let me peer in there and just look at it, I would be like, oh, that's incredible.
So we know the next time there's a conference, you'll be getting there when they first open. Where's the Lego Vault?
Hey, I don't want to hear anything about the conference. Just take me to the Lego Vault.
Oh, that's awesome, man. How many people?
We had a stacked house. I think there was only availability for 200 people. All seats were sold, so all 200 people came to the conference. We had, I think, a good number of pre-conferences. There was 4 pre-cons that were happening, and I believe they were all sold out as well. I think they had 120 people at the pre-con as well, or something roughly around that number. Amazing conference. The food was second to none. The buffet, they had smoked salmon in the morning. It was so good. I kept eating tons of the smoked salmon with like it's cottage cheese and smoked salmon and some kind of other flavor. Oh, it was so good. And there was a speaker dinner, and so I thought of Seth the whole time through speaker dinner.
Locks.
Lock.
That was so good. We had a speaker dinner, and we're gonna do some wine pairings for the speakers. So we had like I don't know, there was like 4 different wines going on, and I had like a million glasses of wine going on, and
Get
everything
out.
different kind of wine. Had an ice wine. There was stuff I've never had, like I think it was a red Merlot and a white Merlot. It was pretty fun. So super cool. You guys got to go next year. We gotta get you guys there when they do it again, because it is definitely worth it's definitely worth a trip to go see the Power BI Next Step conference. Super fun. Special thanks to the organizers, Use, and I'm going to say the name wrong, Asgir, about just preparing everything. You guys, hearts of gold. Super open arms. Very happy to just to make sure people had a good time. I had a blast, and I can't wait to go back again.
So when did you actually get back into the States?
The conference was on a Monday, Tuesday, and then I got back to the States on Friday. That's because I went back with Steve Campbell, who's also a Microsoft MVP. I went back to London, and I hung out in London I've never been to London. I never see. I mean, on the way there, I kind of flew through London, so I got to see the airport, but that was about it. So I came back and said, okay, I'm going to see some of the sites around the area. So we got to go see Big Ben. We got to go see the palace.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that week was all the ceremonies for the Queen. So everything was crazy. There was flowers just all over the place. People had pictures of the Queen on like a tree nearby where the palace was, and there's a huge stack of flowers, just massive, right next to the palace. And then got to see Big Ben. There's a monument to where the London fire occurred, so we got to go see that. I got to go across London Bridge, which is actually not quite impressive. But you look at London Bridge, you can go look at Tower Bridge, which Tower Bridge is the one you think is London Bridge. Every time I look at Tower Bridge, it's the one with the fancy blue pillars and the thing that streams across the middle. It's cool looking. But you look at Tower Bridge and think, oh yeah, that's London Bridge. No, that's a different bridge. The London Bridge just looks like a normal bridge. So it was super fun. I had a great time.
Cool. Awesome.
Have you guys been to London before?
I have not.
We had to travel there after our honeymoon, and so we had to stay there for one night. So we went to a McDonald's in London because it was like everything was already late. Everything was already
that's what
late.
you're doing. That's what I heard.
Yeah,
the thing you do in London is when you go to London, go to McDonald's. That's
we had 2 hours before we got to the hotel.
Representative of the food in the area.
Where are we gonna go? We had 45 minutes. I'm 24 years old, and it was the Monopoly time because they still did Monopoly there.
Oh,
like, congratulations, you won! And I was like, oh great! I can't wait to see what I won. I won porridge.
Porridge, nice.
That's a thing you win.
That's a thing there. So you got to get the fish and chips.
Well, I also had a international escapade, except a little different last week.
Really?
So yeah. So I had a training in Ireland.
Oh yes.
But it was virtual, and they were asking me like, I'm not gonna do an Irish accent, but I mean they're like, are you okay with the early time? I said, yeah, I'm up early with the kids anyways. So I'm looking like the night before because I have everything already prepared. I'm like, okay, what time actually does it start in London time? Well, start at 2:30 in the morning here.
Surprise! It's 7 hours off earlier than us.
Yeah, yes. You would think one would realize this.
Yes.
And so it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I'm like, well, I guess I'm not going to bed now because the fear of not wanting to sleep.
Get up. Yeah.
So I had to text my wife at like 11. Okay, hey, just so you know, my training starts in 3 hours. So don't come downstairs. So I come on the call. They're all ready. It's like 8, 9. Yeah, they're ready to go. And I'm like, hi guys, it's 2:30 in Chicago. Let's start this. It felt like all nighters in college, just about without like the Chinese.
Without any fun.
Without yeah. But it was fun. We had a good time. There were about 30 people, all grads, first learning Power BI for the first time.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
I saw a graph, and again, this was something that I think Greg Baldini brought up, which was when the graph of of Microsoft's growth of their Power BI. They show a graph. They don't show how many users, but they just show the graph, and it's exponentially growing. And they say these little dips here are where Christmas has occurred. So they're showing this graph of how quickly Power BI is being adopted. And if you really look at exponential growth really means every year of growth is more growth than the prior every single year before it. And so Greg Baldini was bringing up this use case. Well, if you actually, if the Power BI team is really, if the Power BI product is really having exponential growth, every year you have more new users than every single user previously in all years, is what exponential growth really means. So I was thinking, oh my gosh, every year, if we're doubling, that's a huge number. And we're talking, so it just put my head around the concept of like, there are so many new people to the Power BI ecosystem that there's a lot of first timers, people under a year old and working with Power BI.
Yeah.
In
Anyways,
the
very
next
good,
5
very
years,
cool.
It's something you've got to keep in mind as
Yeah.
when you've been in it for a long time, right?
Yes.
Because we get old and jaded.
Mhm.
It's like, no, man. There's
I remember when there was a black toolbar
so
on the
let's
right-hand
talk about
side.
Black
yeah.
All those kind of things.
Oh,
Super good.
all right.
Any conferences were awesome. I will say this, regardless, I thoroughly enjoyed all of the conferences we've been to. Super fun. Thank everyone who puts these on. I mean, for both of these conferences, the Data Insight Summit and the Power BI Next Step conference, incredible. I had so much fun with the people there, and the conferences are good, but it's the people. The people make a big difference. And for me, both conferences really felt like the first time I went to the Data Insight Summit again, when there was super technical stuff, lots of learning going on, and the Next Step was great for me because it's not beginner stuff. If you're beginners, you would not want to go to Next Step because it's very technical pieces like code, heavy DAX, design techniques that are very advanced. It's all the heavy stuff that you'd be building inside Power BI. But I really, really enjoyed the conferences, and I hope to see more of them. I think conferences are kind of beyond and maybe back in place again for 2023. So excited to see what kind of comes out of the post-pandemic space for conferences. Should be quite fun. Anyways, let's stop yammering about how great conferences are because not everyone can make it. But let's say we dive into the topic for today. Topic for today is your mental model for visualizations. Interesting topic. We probably have to unpack this and kind of describe what do we mean by this topic. What does a mental model mean for when you're building visualizations? I'm gonna kick this one over to Tommy. Let's unpack this a little bit, Tommy. Let's talk about what do you mean by a mental model, and how do you wrap your head around what kind of visualizations you're building?
Yeah, so we're getting inspiration again by Enrico Bertini, who has this amazing blog on data visualization. He's a college professor who really talks about data visualization. And this article is really where the first paragraph really starts with what is a mental model? What's the single most important neglected concept in visualization? And it's really mental models, according to Enrico. And a mental model is the mental representation of how something works. And it's basically three areas that Enrico puts it in. Do we have a mental model of visualization? Do we have a mental model of data and the world? It's basically our explanation and our thought process of how something actually works in the real world.
I like it.
Realistically, like not realistic. The fun part about talking about mental models is regardless of whether or not you realize they're happening, I think this is the importance of like asking questions in conversation in general, but especially in business, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are concepts of that you have to understand and piece together, right? Build your own Lego model of what this business meaning is, what this process is.
Yep.
And I just thought it'll be an interesting conversation, but really, like, this is why you ask questions, right? Because when somebody's explaining something to you, it's through their lens of how they understand it. And where this becomes really apparent is where you start talking to somebody who thinks in a completely different way, which is really intriguing and also really difficult to understand. and why things like saying like, okay, let me repeat back to you what I heard, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like let me make sure that I'm hitting these core concepts so that when I'm talking about this or thinking about it, it makes sense not only to me, but it's something that I can explain to you, even if you think about it differently.
I like the first part of this article talking about when you listen to someone explain how something works, that is them describing their mental model back to you. So for example, if I asked Tommy, hey Tommy, how does a combustible engine work? Right? And what is happening inside the engine? Tommy's description will be different than mine. Mine will be different than Seth. So that our understanding of how that thing runs.
Right.
And this is something that we use a lot when we talk about Power BI, particularly when we're consulting around it, is there's this, I like to think of this as there's this concept of the Power BI desktop tool. You need to understand it. We call it a framework. We've said this a number of times on the podcast. There's a framework of Power BI. And if you play inside that framework, it's easy to build stuff. You can make visuals. You can build what you want to build, publish reports fairly quickly. No big deal. It's when you get those report requests from users where things are not quite inside that framework. Oh, I really want to be able to change the y-axis color by each word on the axis. Sorry, can't do it. Not going to happen. Oh, I want to be able to have a function that drives the color of the lines in the line chart. Sorry, can't do it. Program won't let you do it. There's walls of what you can play in and which you can't. So I really like the way he's framing this. Is it's really around, do you understand the program and do you understand how it works? Because once you understand it, then you can solve problems with it.
And I think for each of these, there's two different exposures from the consumer point of view and the developer point of view. When we talk about mental models, a quick analogy or example, this really fits into a way of, if you're an engineer or you're a carpenter, the way to think about, like, can you rotate, if you were to think of, let's say, like a chair in your head or a table in your head, can you mentally rotate it in your head and see all the sides? And that would, someone told me that that's a good representation if you're basically a good builder, or you would be probably a good carpenter. And for myself, I can't do it. It's very stagnant. It's not a very smooth rotation. And even when we're thinking about the visual side of this, like, we understand what a bar chart's supposed to do. I mean, again, we are intimately working with all the different standard visuals in Power BI, but for a consumer, a bar chart may not mean the same thing. Forget about, isolate the data right now and what it's supposed to represent, just the bar chart itself. Like, that big difference in a bar chart for us, I mean, we can, in a sense, do that full rotation upside, vertically and horizontally. But for a user who may not be familiar, we're like, it's a bar chart. It's simple. Well, it's not so much simple. And thanks, Carrie. It's spatial rotation. That's the concept.
Tommy, I think sometimes sometimes I feel like you're stuck too much in spatial rotation too long. I feel like that could. Tommy, get out of spatial rotation. Come back to us.
I was wondering where that.
That's just the space part. That's just the space.
Quit spacing out on me.
I think that's spaced out rotation.
Oh, it's spaced. Yes.
Words, they matter, Mike.
Words.
Power BI in space.
So I liked your point there, Tommy, around talking about what is the mental model for consumers of a report and what is your mental model for developers report? Because I think those are probably two different things. I think of things a lot around Power BI for the developer side. Right? What is my mental model? If I'm building custom visuals or if I'm building things inside Power BI desktop, I'm typically building a table first, trying to figure out what are my calculations, and then what are my the dimensions, what are the cuts of the data, right? How am I gonna aggregate that data by, and then I use those dimensions to apply properties to them. So the height of the bar becomes, or the number of bars become a dimension property, or the color of the bar becomes a property. And so that's in my mental model, I'm building that. And I think as you get better at Power BI, you can accelerate faster your ability to build the visual in your head without actually touching the data or the Power BI desktop. Yeah. I can literally build multiple things in my mind and go, oh yeah, they'll ask me a question. Well, we want to do this. I'm like, well, that's not quite possible. You have to do A, B, and C first, and then I kind of close my eyes and I can kind of see my mind working. It's just like, and it starts like I start getting spatial in there, and then it, the mind's eye kicks on, and I can start thinking through like what happens and how I would build it without actually touching desktop because I've done it so much.
I think there's three kind of points that stand out to me when we're talking about like the mental model of visualization as it relates to the end user, right? And we've talked about this in a couple different ways, but it kind of resonates in this description to me. And one of those is you're typically going to challenge thought patterns, right? Because people have a mental model of something, and if we're challenging something in a visualization, you need to bring them along for the ride, right? Because and that could be in two different ways. One is, hey, it's great if you can be there to explain it because you're going to be stretching the bounds of like what their mental model is sometimes, or maybe produce a visualization that they haven't seen before. But how do you do that? Like, I guess the thought that comes to me, or the question is, how do you do that without being there, without explaining it, right? And I think we've talked about ensuring you have other, whether it's a page, indicators, like something that explains what the visual is doing, or the narrowing in on the page and what we're trying to accomplish in terms of a use case.
Yep.
But it kind of speaks to the also like the level of data literacy of the organization,
right,
or individuals that you're producing things for, right? And almost like, well, anyway, those are the three random thoughts that just kind of.
I like that a lot because I think that puts into context that it's not one report that's going to solve it. Like, no matter where you are in an organization, it's a gradual process. Just like you can't give someone a car that has all the helpers on, here's how to start the car, if you've never driven one. You still have to have the education and the knowledge of how to use the technology, going back to the technology piece, where even if you have those helpers in a report, that's not going to be the be all end all. There has to be that gradual growth in the company or the organization, and in the people on, I understand how to use this. I have the concept of both the technology and the data within it. And I think that comes in part of us gradually progressing, gradually educating the users on, we're going to be looking at departments. Here's what sales is. Here's how you interact with the visual. If people are at least don't have that cognitive load on what am I even looking at, how do I actually use the tool, then the visual side becomes a lot easier. But it's a hindrance unless we actually provide that education.
I think you make a really solid point here, Seth. And a lot of my design process on how I build reports, we talk a lot about this insights to action type elements. And so the insightful thing is, okay, what is the question I'm trying to ask of my data? Are my sales up year over year? Are my sales increasing? Right? That's a generic question. You could answer that question a number of different ways with multiple different visuals. You could look at year over year sales patterns. You could look at number of sales by a person. You could look at number of sales by a region. And I think when you are building a report page, I think it's important for us to quantify, or at least write down or describe, this is the kind of question I'm trying to answer. By having that statement clear, and even potentially even on the page, right? I think that helps frame. When I see people building visuals, that usually put too much on a page. There's too much there.
Right.
But by narrowing down and focusing on a single question, and that one question, we call that a topic, right? There's a topic of questions. What are my sales? Who's leading sales? Where did most of my sales growth come from? It's kind of related about the same area, but you're kind of maybe cutting the sales numbers different ways. By keeping that on the one page and describing, the sales data page, you actually have the ability to then add helper tooltips on the visuals. Why is this visual here, right? This visual is here because it's showing year-over-year growth based on our product lines. It shows you which product line is growing the fastest. So you can actually start catering some of that story. And the reason I bring this up is because I feel like if you don't provide context to what you're trying to build visually, people come in asking all kinds of other questions that are not relevant to what you built. And I think that's where the disconnect, I feel like, comes from when you're building report pages, is you try to answer question A, what are my sales, how is sales growth performing? And someone else comes in and says, well, how does HR and hiring help us or hurt us based on sales growth? do we, how do, so something, there's another question coming to this page that it's not geared to answer. And then everyone comes, freaks out and they're like, this report sucks because we can't get the answers we want. Well, we weren't building the page for your question. If you want that, that's a separate page. That's a separate topic. We got to figure out, well, how do we answer your question with some data that we have? And that might be a separate page in the report. Does that kind of resonate with you guys?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've talked about that in previous podcasts where I should just stop saying that because after 100,
we've talked about everything.
We probably thought that
nothing's new about on this point.
But yeah, I mean, absolutely. When you set those boundaries, however you do it, it gives context to the report.
Yeah,
right? And we talked about having the page that says, here's the context for this conversation.
Yeah.
If you want to have a different conversation, we can have one, but it's not by looking at this report.
Correct.
Right. And the more you go into insight-driven reports where a lot of thought has gone behind them to produce aggregation, the visualizations.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say tell the story because a lot of it's just analysis in reporting, but it's a higher level than just data dumping.
Sure.
And when you get into that realm, always having that guardrail in those conversations just makes the conversations much easier.
Yeah, totally.
Well, yeah. So one concern, though,
then you can deflect those questions, right?
Yeah.
Why doesn't it answer this question? That's not what it was designed to do.
Yeah.
Right.
What you're asking is different than what we built this page to do.
See page A, summary.
Exactly. Yes, exactly right. Sorry, Tommy, go ahead.
No, but one concern, I completely agree with the always answer your question. Like, I think we're all on the same page. If there's anything that this podcast has pushed, it's that. But I think one concern when we add that question is it really isolates or at least segments the audience, right? You might have gone from a more general audience to a much more targeted. And I want to go back to what Enrico said, because this guy is amazing in terms of what he writes for the articles. He talks about a mental model for visualization. It doesn't matter if you write exactly what the report's going to do if someone does not have a concept of how to read a visual. And I think we have to really remember that there's people on all aspects of that education curve, or that be able to really conceptualize what that visual is trying to say. So he writes about the model of visualization, and it's basically, this is the understanding of how to read a visual and what it means. If I show you a bar chart from your previous exposure to bar charts, that each bar represents an object or a property, you know that you're supposed to compare. And like, what happens if you see a new type of chart you've never encountered? Well, you start making sense of it using your previous knowledge and cues that exist in visualizations.
That's a good point.
So, and I think that's a huge part, like, as much as obviously being able to answer a question and having some objective and concept for the organization or a department is going to be huge. But if users are still overwhelmed, if they're overwhelmed by the visuals being used, even if they're standard, it doesn't matter if we say, hey, this is exactly what it answers. We have to give people that basis understanding of how to read visuals, or at least how to not be overwhelmed by it.
This speaks to what Seth, you were saying earlier, is there's this data literacy that's going on. Does the data culture understand so something that opened my mind is when I went through the Delta Bronze training. It was basically, at the time it was Delta Bronze, and now they've called it Delta Associates Black Belt. It was for category management. Opened my eye for like how analytics should be done, because a lot of people can look at a lot of information and not understand where is most of the information impacting your bottom line sales, right? So it gets really, there's a lot of interesting concepts around like market share analysis, and doing a lot of things with category management pieces. You may be losing year-over-year sales, but you may be growing in the size of the category, and therefore it may be your strongest seller in your company. So to have a mental model around, hey, you could actually be selling less product year over year, but you might be gaining market share more so than your competitors. That's a huge win potentially, even in your business, even though it looks on the surface potentially bad. We want the numbers to always go up, but when you start thinking about how do you position your company and your products in the marketplace, you could actually be winning, even though it looks like you're losing. So having more thoughts around, they use a term that they've coined called position and direction. Love the term, because you can have a bar chart and point out the monthly sales, but who cares? Is it up? Is it down? Is that good or bad? We don't know. And so looking at your position and then adding an equivalent calculation around the direction.
Right.
I'm at 2.2 million in sales and I'm up 5% or 10% or down 3%, whatever that means. Now there's deeper analytics, but you have to have your team must understand the context of what that means and what you're trying to produce visually. Because if you can produce all the great visuals in the world, but if your team can't understand it, is it really then the right visual?
Yeah, I think there's well, we haven't approached into the other areas, but like in visualization, right? Understanding what types of visuals are available to you, but also I think the key is understanding the business behind what you're trying to produce with the insights of those visuals, right? Like that's where it comes into me, as far as like having more more of the mental application of the mental model of that, right?
Yeah. Another area that I would point out here as well, when I'm thinking about what you said, Tommy, is the ability of when you click on certain things in Power BI, all the data changes potentially, right? So if you have, filtering options on, you can click on a product and then the entire page, all the KPIs adjust to what you had clicked on. That was kind of a new way of thinking, because previously I was used to Excel. Nothing was clickable. You could have multiple visuals, and if you wanted to click anything, you had to have a slicer on the page, and that would then change visuals in Excel. But now in Power BI, there's this new everything is interactive layer that's, again, net new to a lot of people.
Right.
So
it's like a mental model for interactivity.
Yeah. I've changed how I build visuals now, and I understand, oh, well, if we're going to, if someone wants to see a particular category, well, I'll just add a slicer for that category. Yeah. And then you pick the category you want as if it was a slicer, but it's in the visual. And then the whole page adjusts for that particular category.
I've seen people when they've clicked on a visual, like act like they dropped a glass of water. Like, oh my goodness. Like,
whoa.
And there's an overwhelming feeling to that if you've never seen it. And I think it's a concept that I think in this aspect, we'll put that part of the visualization side, because that is very ingrained with Power BI, but that has to be part of that, where even if you have that, here's what this report means, as soon as they click on something, or like, I want to filter by this, and they filter the bar chart, everything changes. They might not even know everything changes. It's also having that cognitive load to like, hey, here's a little funnel icon. Here's you can see what's being interacted. But we need to enable our consumers, and we also need to build the reports in a way too. Like I think everything we're talking about is that twofold approach, where we need to have the education for the consumers to be able to understand it, that exists. But we also have to build the reports in a certain way where it's not too complicated when they do that thing, right? Where it's a simple approach. If I click on the bar chart, I can see the line chart.
Yes, exactly.
I
think you're doing a lot of like work around how does the end user perceive this report? What will they click on? Right. What's their user journey in the report? So just at least trying to do some simplification there. So you could build this amazing long page report with tons and tons of visuals in it, but if it's not helping them get to their answers, then why are we doing it?
Right. You coined this term a while ago, and I really do love it for the aspect of Power BI, but it's a data application.
Yeah.
And it really is. And I think we have to build that UI in that way.
To me, that aha moment came on, like data application, like, this is like, you look at what app dev people can build. I mean, we're bringing this data into this interactive space, and we can really tweak the experience. And for me, that moment clicked on when I was using bookmarks. That's when I think when bookmarks was introduced, I was like, oh, we are no longer building just a report.
Right.
Because before then it was just kind of like stuff on a page, good to go. But when I could like have fly out menus, when I could hide stuff, when I could have, hide the slicers off the page so I could have more landscape for the report page piece, or I could switch out a visual using a button. To me, that's when I was like, okay, this feels much more like web development than it does report building. And so to see how that was working, I was like, oh yeah, this feels like an app now. It's a data app.
So I want to touch on the other two models that Enrico puts in, because one, he says is the most important, but I think how much these all fit together when we're building any report, or our ability really goes into the next two.
Sure.
Is model of the data and model of the world.
Yep.
And obviously the model of the data is pretty straightforward. It's our understanding or at least for us from a developer, can be overlooked, but it's the understanding or the concept of how something's actually counted. Like when we say total sales, sure, straightforward, right? I've said enough on this podcast and to others why this was an epiphany moment for me at a previous organization when we were counting leads, where marketing counted leads based on form submissions, sales counted leads based on if they called them. And if you have that misunderstanding, or not even misunderstanding, if it's not straightforward, understood, clear cut, the visual side is always going to be something that's going to be hard, nearly impossible to overcome.
I think the model of the data, and so when I go to model the data, I think about there's kind of there's two things I think of when I think about modeling data. One is I think about the DAX statements and what you're now on top of a star schema, hopefully, right? If you're trying to get to a star schema as much as possible to make the model simple and fast. You're also thinking about the DAX that you're going to write, and then I think a lot about filter context. What is the filter context that's occurring when I'm moving around on my report page when I think modeling the data? And I mean, not to underestimate this. I mean, the DAX portion, if there is one thing in Power BI Desktop I think is the hardest thing to get your head around, it's the DAX. It's the filter context across different visuals and what is being filtered to get to a single number. I think that's by far the hardest concept of Power BI in general.
Yeah, if you think that's difficult for us, think about the consumers.
Right?
I think you point out one of the key areas in which having a solid mental model is really important as you're building things. The point I would make here is if people aren't familiar with how to build a strong data mental model, like the pieces of getting there is why I recommend always doing like a data mapping exercise. If you're not familiar with the data set, like figuring out where does it come from, potentially the lineage, but it's like, what are the columns you're going to need for the report? How do those apply to what's being requested? Looking at the core information versus the questions that are being asked to produce insights, right? Because ultimately what that mapping allows you to do is basically have that constant reference. And if we're going to continue on with the Lego theme, which was very apropos today in mental model building.
There we go. Yes.
Legos.
Building things. Yes.
So it's your build sheet, right? So
Yeah.
as we start to assemble these mental constructs that are in place to start producing insights for a particular report, it's your frame of reference that you can keep coming back to and make sure that as you're constructing, the path towards building a report for someone that has meaning, you can rely on these artifacts that you build along the way, right? Like starts with that mapping. You can do relationships, the diagram out, like how do the flow of the data coming through here, for what visuals is it going to, like what sort of visualization do I want to create based on the data that I have, and all of those things really help to solidify your understanding of what the business is underneath just the data that you're looking at. And that's where the value comes in, right? Because what we're trying to do is provide insights to business people to make business decisions. It's not just about the technical aspects of data and we get to manipulate and play with it. We have to have a clear understanding of what it is we're trying to accomplish with the data that we're seeing in the context of the business itself. And I think you alluded to that prior, Mike, right? Where you have the different concepts of looking at, a particular visualization related to sales, right?
Exactly right. It's like telling an Italian you're eating noodles. The mental model is not there. Their head will literally break.
Yeah. Well, they're not going to know what you're talking about. Like, what are we doing? Takeout?
It's pasta. It's pasta.
It's pasta. Well, no, but there's a side chat going on. Is mental models more individual based, not organizational based? And I think fine grained, it's definitely individual. But I think when you are dealing with a group of people, there is going to be a similar mind frame or mindset.
Well, I think this is where the community of practice or the center of excellence would come into play here, right? So I think Harry makes an interesting point. Everyone has their own mental model of like, what is the visualization doing? What is the data doing? The people have formed their opinions around how this is going to work. And so as us as designers, or as a community of practice, or if we're rolling out into an organization, this is how we visualize things. There needs to be a common level of education, so we can look at and say, hey, when we say bar chart, this is what we mean. When we use this scatter plot, this is what we mean. There's a, you're trying to now, and when you work on I don't know, this is something very random. I was listening to another podcast somewhere, and it was the idea of when you communicate with somebody, they can monitor your wavelength in your brain. And when you're talking to someone, if someone is following and tracking along with you, your brave wavelengths kind of are starting to do the same thing, right? You're thinking about the same stuff. And when a speaker is talking to a listener, they start getting on the same wavelength, and they understand what's going on. It sounds like that's similar. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. And I feel like this is similar when we talk about mental models, because in the same way as we're building, we have a mental model as we build the report. We want to align our mental model with other people so they can have a similar mental model to get their head around, oh, this is what they're trying to tell me. Oh, here's where the problem is. We need to go, do this action over here to increase sales, or wow, we're spending a lot of marketing money, but we're not getting much return on it. We can have that insight, that action be revealed to multiple people. And then as we align the mental models together, people can understand things or convey messages between people.
So I think that makes sense why our internet always breaks when the three of us talk, because our wavelengths aren't. We're breaking the internet. No, but I think that really goes into the next one, the idea of the model of the world.
Yeah.
And I think this is where developers have the hardest struggle, because we understand how things are counted, and we know the DAX, and we've done maybe a good job with the education of what a bar chart does for the organization. But it's us really scabbing or uncovering for the domain user what they're, what's the most important part for the layperson. For example, like you can say to someone who's in supply chain, like, hey, what's important to you? It's like, well, I just want to make sure that my department is on top of things. Well, that's like the top layer, but really there's probably a set number for their team or department where it's like, if we're 19 days, like past X, Y, and Z, that's a concern. Like that's where I need to have my team alerted, where it's really those objectives that are going to affect them. And that's really for us where we have to really uncover where that there's another world that people live in outside of the data and the visuals, that they live in a day-to-day basis, what they're trying to look at, and that they're communicating with their team that we don't get to see. And that's where they either have a boss going, why is X, Y, and Z not done? Or why is this late? Where they may not communicate that to us, but that's going to be what's the most impactful to them.
I feel like in many of these projects, there's this challenge around, at some point, you get the information, you get the data comes to you. At some point in time throughout the project, there's this moment where you have there's like a decision point. You can relate some piece of data to another, so I'm thinking like facts and dimensions, right? I have like sales data, and I have like sales manager data, whatever that may be, right? And in some cases, there's not always a clear-cut decision between, okay, where do the sales numbers apply? Like, for example, who's making the decisions on which customer is in which region, right? If a customer, like, let's imagine we're a sales team, we're working with very large companies. We may work with a company who's based out of Europe, but may have offices all over the world. So who then owns the account, right? There's these kind of like situations where the real world model of how data comes together is not as clean cut as we would like the Power BI data model to be. Right. Like, oh, I want one person to manage one customer, boom, done. Right. But in reality, it's a lot messier than that. So how do we do bonuses, and so this real world of where the data in the real world is not always as clean cut as we would like. How do you represent that information when you get into the report? And so someone that at some point has to make the decision. And then this is where I think a lot of these things get interesting for me, is when you start talking about, okay, what is the breakdown? What is the representation of the real world data, and how do we represent it inside Power BI?
It's a funny idea. I've been starting to ask people this more to kind of grab that data, where I say, what is the risk of having no information on a certain subject at this point? If you had none at all, like what risk would that be if you didn't have X, Y, and Z? And that kind of begins to uncover, oh, well, if this is, delayed or X, Y, and Z, and what's the value of now actually having this displayed? Warren Buffett actually has a really good quote. I'm also going to start using more, where I would rather be partially correct than precisely incorrect. And even when people say, no, we don't have exact numbers, like, well, what can we get to you that would at least help you act? And I think that goes back to this, where and it is so hard for us to extract this part of the mental model for the user. But I think it's the most important part, the most important aspect.
So this conversation kind of brings to light a previous scenario I've interacted with in a business, right? Where when you don't have what I think is one of the most important things as report authors for people who are constructing their own mental model of the report that you're generating, right? They're piecing it into their worldview of which is just their exposure to how many outside influences or charts or graphs or things that they've read that make sense to them. And without that clarity of intent and documentation, a great representation of not having any of that in a report is you start competing with mental models, right? People are like, what really makes sense to me in this report is we should produce this. And then you're like, okay, yeah, we can produce that. And then all it takes is a little time to go by. And then someone else comes in and they says, when I read this report, it doesn't make sense because like this is what we should be doing with it.
Their mental model is different.
Right. Okay, I can change that, but there's no frame of reference, right? Like, and that's what I think is really important to give the end user in some way, shape, or form with your insight reporting is the frame of reference. Give them context and why it was built the way it was, so that when they're digesting, be it a visual, be it the page of visuals, or how you're representing the insights on the page, there's a frame of reference for that consumption that hopefully either locks into something that they're familiar with or stretches just a little bit. So it's not like they go off on this wild tangent of, Mike, to your point, well, I see sales data, but it should be relevant to my area.
Right.
Exactly,
that's
right.
what I see in this report.
And you're trying to look at that report and the lens of your mental model,
right?
And you're trying to interpret against what you understand to be true. And if you don't, if how the data was engineered, if how the DAX was written or the visuals were built is using a different mental model, of course you'll come in confused. Oh, I thought parts were related to this, or I thought we had, color on every part. We don't. Oh, well, shoot, that messes up my mental model now. Like, there's these. The disconnect again, I think this is all fitting very well because there's the model of what real world things are doing. There's the model of the data and what you're doing to produce that, and then there's the mental model of the user of the report that they're trying to visualize or understand what's occurring on the report page. It's a very interesting concept.
Well, and let me ask you about our responsibility in this, because Seth, I've had a very similar situation there that you kind of struck home for me, where we were building this model to try to measure cost, but cost in the sense in this project didn't really exist. There wasn't like a per click spend, right? And
wait, what?
Hold on. Yeah, sorry. I'm going spatial rotation again.
It's Tommy, come back from space. Tommy, come back from space.
Let me back up. So our job to try to communicate, we were basically putting together a framework for measuring something that was imprecise, right? Because it wasn't like direct cost to effort, and or however we want to put it. And we had a lot of pushback from the consumer or from the stakeholder, because they're like, it's not 100% accurate. Well, 100% accuracy was never going to exist in this case. So it eventually died. Now, knowing what I know now and talking about information a little to this point, like, we're trying to not just, again, be always obviously as precise as we can, but when we are building things, a bigger part what we're trying to do is that domain world for the user, on allowing them to have more information that's valuable, that they can act on, at least to go back to that partially correct, to at least make a decision on. The question then being, when we are building things where we have imprecise measurements, or imprecise data. How important is us to educate or try to push that, or should we always be doing things that are very precise?
I only work in high 100% precision.
Of course you do. Well,
I'll just tease it.
yeah.
I mean, I think sometimes it's, can we get close enough to make a decision?
Yeah.
Right? How close? Like how accurate do you need to be able to make a decision? And where? So I mean, I deal a lot in like statistics, right? That was like a space that I spent as a mechanical engineer. I spent a ton of time just we would build a bunch of parts. Those parts would come off the line, and I would just measure stuff, measure. And then if something was out of tolerance, I could clearly see on a graph, oh yeah, the distribution of the parts coming off the line are now so far away that we have a problem. We need to stop what we're building and go look at the problem. And I really like this this concept of like what you were just saying, Tommy. Like when is the point when we have to make a decision? So right. I think as I feel like I'm building reports, I'm trying to relate this back to reports now. As I think about building reports, I'm trying to build reports precise enough that we have confidence in being able to make a certain type of decision. There are times when you're going to bring data elements together in a report that you're not actually going to be able to make the decision. It's maybe it's not quite clear enough. So then you either ask different questions, or you start focusing on a different area to take action, so you can make or maybe even adding different data. Frankly, I mean. Yeah. There's this whole concept of like, metrics that the Power BI team has built out, right? So you have data. Well, why not apply? What are our goals? What are we trying to achieve? Do we have measurements that we can go against, which helps frame up the context? Are we meeting our goals or not?
And I think go ahead.
No, I mean, the thing that I would say in this scenario is context matters, right? A lot, right? So if we're out of the precision game and we're doing discovery on something, or we're doing some analysis on an area of business, whatnot, like understanding what the full scope of something looks like. If we had precision in this area, what does that look like? Is that 500 customers, right? And that's the scope of precision that we would have if we had the data. Yeah. But what we have available to us, or what we're trying to accomplish, only gives us about 100 of them. Yeah. Right. Yep. Having that context of, hey, our analysis is covering about 20%. And fact check my math. I don't know if I'm right. Like I'm just saying, right? 20%.
Yeah, works for me.
Is that enough? Is that enough to like provide us a level of information and confidence coming out of this analysis that we want to make a decision for the other 400, or is it not, right? And a perfect example of this happened just yesterday, where somebody was presenting a bunch of numbers of like how metrics and KPIs, right? Like, oh man, like this is the value that's being provided, this is what's going on. And then like two or three slides in, it was pointed out that, well, what is the holistically, what do all of these good numbers mean? Mm-hmm. Well, it was only 25% of the area. It's like, okay, well, that's a problem, because if our whole charge is 100% of the area, then where my mental model was going was completely wrong. Right. Yeah. But as I say that, right, that's where it's really important for us to be clear in the type of reporting that we're doing, so that we construct the right mental model, because this is how we lead people down different paths of like thinking Tommy's report is producing this value, when in reality it's not doing that at all. Well,
have you guys seen like this actually plays on these optical illusions that you can play with graphs, like seeing like this is another thing, like you can play on people's mental models and make things look worse than they really are, depending on what mental model you produce for them. So for example, I'm going to just imagine you have a bar chart and all the numbers are in the millions, so they're very tall bars, but we're varying the data within $10,000 or something like that, right? The bars are the bars will almost be flat. There's almost no variation in the bars. If you replace that graph with a line chart, you can see the line bouncing all over the place. That's because in a line chart, you're not really supposed to anchor the bottom of the line chart to a zero increment. So you can show, like, on one hand, you look at a graph and go, we're fine. There's no change needed. And then the other graph, you're like, oh my gosh, we're losing all kinds of money all over the place. We're like And so I feel like there's this moment here where sometimes even as report builders, we need to be able to aptly, how do I say this one, correctly articulate when there are problems, because we have the ability to I want to say accentuate, but maybe that's not the overemphasize a data points based on the types of graph you're using. Oh man,
yeah.
that's like another whole
Yeah.
another whole podcast in of itself. You know, the liars chart, right? You know, the things from Alberto Carrera, I think is his name, that talks about the liars chart, or how charts lie. Is another
yeah. And I think on the other side of the coin, like Enrico says, what is the most important model? He says the primacy of the world model. Like both the data and the visual side are a means to achieve the goal of helping the world model. And I think too, we're trying to focus always on that precise number. Like we're always reporting to corporate, what is total sales year to date? And if we're thinking in that way, we're never going to, not never, but we are always not as much we're not going to focus as much on the world model for the consumer, where we may not have a precise number, but we're helping, to your point, Mike, and what you both said, where our point is to help drive decision. And maybe that is a imperfect number. Maybe that is something where we're not just doing sum of sales, but it's something that maybe is 80% correct, but it's information that's more valuable to the consumer had they not had it at all.
Correct.
But that's in their worldview. That is in their world model on what their day-to-day is. And so rather than going, what numbers do you want, that pick from the catalog, pick from what we already have available in our data model.
Yes.
And because that's how we think.
Like we're always exactly right.
Think, what number are we going to count or sum or aggregate? But they're not, they're thinking on what the emails that they're getting that we can still do and count and measure, but it's going to take a little more tinkering on our end. And it's not going to be precise.
It's hard to know when to compromise, though. I think that is a tough call. When is close enough good enough? That should be another podcast episode. When close enough is good enough.
Yeah.
Depends on what you're building, right?
Sure, yeah, right.
To me, this is part of the engineering mindset. Like a mechanical engineer builds a bridge, right? If a mechanical engineer builds a bridge, they're like, yeah, I think this bridge will be this safe. Okay, let's just double the safety factor and just make it super strong. Like
right.
it's close enough. Let's just make it just double it and we're good. We move on. Like we're fine.
If I see a bridge that says close enough, I'm going to start taking the boat.
Yeah. So this bridge is close enough to hold 10,000 pounds. Pass if you want. Like
Greggy B, when close enough is good enough. The explicit measures story. You're like, oh, thanks, man. Yeah. That's exactly right.
Oh goodness!
I guess we're not going on vacation, kids.
Hey,
we're turning around.
we just leave. We leave enough room for people to yell at us, or
exactly. You're in the hospital, and how much epinephrine do you need to fight that bee sting? 50 cc. That should be close enough. Is good enough. Let's hit him with that. I don't even know. Like that's probably not the area where you want close enough is good enough. You want a little bit more precision around this, I think.
My doctor was doing surgery. It's going to be close enough.
There are some places where you can get away with that. There are some places where you cannot.
Yeah. UI is one of them.
All right. Well, we've burned through actually a pretty good amount of time here. We're almost right at an hour. 2 hours.
2 hours.
It's gone by fast. It hasn't gone by that fast. We thank you very much. So we want to just kind of do a wrap here. Thank you all very much for joining us for another episode of the Explicit Measures podcast. Thank you everyone who's listened. The chat, awesome. Thank you very much for your points. And love having you guys jumping in the conversation as well. We really appreciate your participation. And our only ask for running with the podcast is if you like this podcast, if you thought there were some good points or some notes here, we'd love it if you'd share it. Share it on your social medias. Talk to someone about it at work. Go to a conference. Let someone else know you found a pretty fun podcast. Gives you a couple laughs and definitely instills your confidence that you should never walk across a bridge that Mike builds. Those kind of things. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find the podcast anywhere they're available. Apple, Spotify. Learn more about imperfect models on the Explicit Measures podcast.
Awesome. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.